Right now, inside your body, your kidneys are, well, they're basically making a life or death calculation. I feel like most of us think of our kidneys as just, passive plumbing, like organic water filters, just pulling waste out of our blood to make urine.
Yeah, that's definitely the standard view.
Right. But in reality, they're secretly acting as the master thermostat for your entire circulatory system. And if they get the math wrong, they can pull this biological fire alarm that slowly destroys your heart.
It really is a complete paradigm shift when you realize what's actually happening down there. Because, when we talk about a thermostat, think about how you heat a house.
Okay.
You don't just put a fire in the middle of the room. You have a sensor that detects the temperature, and when it drops, it sends a signal to the furnace to pump heat into every single room until things normalize. The kidneys do the exact same thing, but instead of temperature, they are obsessively monitoring the pressure of your blood.
And today, our mission for this deep dive is to figure out exactly how they do that. We are unpacking a massive stack of physiological research to look at one of the most powerful, complex biological machines inside of you, the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system.
Which is quite a mouthful.
It is, so we usually just call it the RAAS. We want to uncover how this system perfectly controls your blood pressure, and more importantly, how it causes chronic high blood pressure when it, goes rogue.
To really appreciate how sneaky this system is, we have to look back at how we first figured out it existed. Because for a very long time, the medical establishment flat out refused to believe the kidneys were even capable of this.
Right, so let's set the scene. I want to picture the mindset back in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Doctors basically viewed the cardiovascular system as rigid plumbing, right? The heart was the pump, the vessels were the pipes, and the kidneys were just the drains.
That was the absolute dogma. The idea that a filtering organ could secretly pull the strings of the entire cardiovascular system hormonally, it just didn't compute for them. But then in 1898, a couple of researchers in Sweden did an experiment that honestly should have changed everything overnight.
The Tigerstedt and Bergman experiment, yeah.
Exactly. They took an extract from a rabbit's kidney, literally just a saline mash of kidney tissue, and injected it directly into the bloodstream of other rabbits.
See, I am always amazed by the sheer Wild West of early physiology experiments. They just inject kidney mash into another rabbit. What actually happens?
They observed a massive, sustained spike in the recipient rabbit's blood pressure.
Wow!
Right? It proved the kidneys weren't just filtering blood. They contained some mysterious chemical that could travel through the body and command the blood vessels to tighten up. They named this substance renin. So they essentially proved the kidney was a powerful endocrine gland.
But the scientific community just completely ignored it.
Oh, completely.
They essentially said, no, that doesn't fit our rigid pipes model, and they threw the discovery in a drawer for over 30 years. It wasn't until the 1930s that another researcher decided to tackle this from a totally different angle.
Yeah, Harry Goldblatt in 1934. He wanted to see what would happen if you starved a kidney of its blood supply. So he performed a procedure on dogs where he placed a tiny silver clamp on the renal artery, which is the main pipe feeding blood into the kidney.
Just a tiny clamp.
Yeah, and he tightened it just enough to restrict the flow, but not enough to kill the organ.
So he essentially pinched the hose, and the result was intense, sustained high blood pressure throughout the entire body of the dog.
Exactly. He proved definitively that reducing blood flow to the kidney directly causes systemic hypertension.
Okay, let me make sure I'm visualizing this correctly. By pinching that hose, he was basically tricking the kidney, right? The kidney feels that local drop in pressure, and because it doesn't have eyes, it assumes the entire body is in a state of shock, like there's been a massive hemorrhage somewhere.
Right. It doesn't know there's a clamp.
So it panics, and it cranks the pressure back up to save the body.
That is the perfect way to look at it. The kidney is acting as the ultimate survival sensor. If it thinks you are bleeding to death, it will force the rest of the body to raise the pressure. But that brought up the million-dollar question. What is the actual chemical signal the kidney is sending out to make that happen?
Which brings us back to that kidney mash from 1898, renin.
Right. You'd assume renin was the thing directly tightening the blood vessels. But when two different research teams finally isolated it in the late 1930s, Page and Helmer in the U.S. and Braun Menendez in Argentina, they realized renin itself doesn't tighten anything. It's not the active ingredient.
Wait, I feel like that's a huge misconception. Renin itself doesn't actually raise your blood pressure.
It has absolutely zero direct ability to constrict your blood vessels.
Totally.
Yeah. Renin is just an enzyme. Think of it as a biological pair of chemical scissors. And understanding how those scissors work is the key to understanding the entire Rube Goldberg machine of blood pressure control.
Okay, let's trace this cascade step by step because it is wild. It starts with sensing the problem. Where exactly is the thermostat located?
Down at the microscopic level, inside the kidney, you have millions of these tiny filtration units. Right where the blood vessel enters each filter, the entrance pipe, there is a cluster of specialized cells, the juxtaglomerular cells.
The JG cells.
Right, they sit on the wall of the blood vessel acting as microscopic pressure gauges.
But how do they know the difference between a real emergency like, I don't know, me bleeding out from an animal attack and me just standing up from the couch too fast?
Because they cross-reference the data. They don't just rely on pressure. They wait for 3 specific triggers before they release those renin scissors. First, yes, a direct physical drop in pressure against the vessel wall. Second, they get intel from a neighboring cluster of cells that acts as a sodium sensor.
Why sodium? What does salt have to do with bleeding out?
Well, in the body, sodium and water are inextricably linked. If fluid is moving sluggishly through the kidney because your overall blood volume is low, the kidney has more time to absorb sodium out of that fluid. So by the time the fluid hits the sensor, which is called the macula densa, the sodium levels are unusually low. The sensor tells the pressure gauges, hey, fluid is barely moving here, we might be bleeding.
Oh, wow. That is incredibly clever. So it checks pressure, it checks flow rate via sodium, and what's the third trigger?
The nervous system, specifically the sympathetic nerves. Your fight or flight response. If you're intensely stressed or in danger, your brain can bypass the local sensors entirely and command those kidney cells to release renin directly, even if your blood pressure and sodium are totally fine at that moment. Your body's anticipating a threat.
So the alarm is pulled, the kidney dumps this renin into the bloodstream, and you said renin is just a pair of scissors. What is it cutting?
It's cutting a very specific protein that your liver is constantly churning out. Your liver makes this large, completely inactive precursor protein called angiotensin, and it just leaves it floating around in your blood at all times waiting for an emergency. When renin hits the bloodstream, it finds that protein and snips a piece off.
And that creates angiotensin the first.
Right, but here's the crazy part. Angiotensin I is also basically useless. It's still too weak to do anything on its own. It's just a middleman that circulates in the blood until it gets pumped into your lungs.
Wait, why the lungs?
Because your lungs have a massive surface area of microscopic capillaries, designed for absorbing oxygen. The inside of those capillaries is studded with a second enzyme called ACE, angiotensin-converting enzyme. When that weak angiotensin I floats through the lungs, ACE acts as a second pair of scissors. It snips it one more time.
And that final snip creates angiotensin the second, which is the true effector. That is the molecule that actually pulls the levers to raise your blood pressure.
And it pulls almost every lever the body has, all simultaneously. It is perfectly engineered for redundancy. If you are a hunter-gatherer losing blood in the wild, you need a system that attacks the problem from every possible angle.
Yeah, I'm looking at the sheer number of things angiotensin the second does all at once, and it's staggering. First, it directly hits the muscles around your tiny arteries and forces them to violently constrict. That shrinks the pipes, instantly raising the pressure, but that's just a short-term fix, right?
Exactly. It needs long-term backup.
Yeah.
So angiotensin II travels to your adrenal glands, which sit right on top of your kidneys, and forces them to release a hormone called aldosterone.
Okay.
Aldosterone's entire job is to command the kidneys to hold onto every single drop of sodium and water they can find, bulking up your total blood volume over the next few hours and days.
So it shrinks the pipes, and then it adds more fluid to the pipes. Oh, and it also goes to your brain and triggers a massive thirst response, making you want to drink more water to add even more fluid.
Yeah, and it directly tells the kidneys to absorb sodium, too. It is a synchronized, multi-organ survival response. It really is a biological miracle.
A miracle if you're bleeding out in the woods, sure. But what happens when that localized pressure sensor inside the kidney makes a mistake? What happens when it becomes a tyrant to the rest of the body?
This is where we move from a brilliant survival mechanism to a devastating chronic disease. Let's look at what happens when the pipes get clogged as we age, a condition called renal artery stenosis. This is essentially what Goldblatt was doing to the dogs with the silver clamp, but it happens naturally.
So the main artery feeding the kidney gets narrowed down, maybe by cholesterol plaque or fibromuscular dysplasia, where the artery wall itself gets overly thick?
Yes. So imagine you have one kidney sitting behind a narrow pipe. Systemically, your whole body blood pressure might be perfectly normal, but that one kidney isn't getting enough flow. It feels low pressure, assumes you are bleeding to death, and it floods the entire body with renin.
The kidney is essentially gaslighting the rest of the body. It's saying, we are dying, crank the pressure, and the heart and vessels are saying, everything was fine a minute ago, but okay. The result is severe, sudden onset, high blood pressure, driven entirely by one confused sensor.
And it's a completely correctable cause of hypertension, but only if a doctor knows to look for that narrowed artery.
But there's another way this thermostat breaks that totally blew my mind when looking at the sources. What if the problem isn't the kidney sensor at all? What if the problem is the adrenal gland?
Ah, you're talking about primary aldosteronism,
Yeah.
sometimes called Conn syndrome.
Right. This is where a tiny benign tumor grows on your adrenal gland. And that tumor just starts pumping out massive amounts of aldosterone all by itself, completely ignoring the kidney signals. The thermostat isn't just broken. The furnace has decided to turn itself on and throw away the remote control.
The adrenal gland goes rogue. It commands the kidneys to aggressively hoard salt and water, expanding the blood volume and driving blood pressure through the roof. And because it's manipulating the salt balance, it also causes patients to excrete all their potassium, which leads to dangerous muscle cramps and weakness.
Now, what stunned me about this is the scale of the problem. If I recall my old biology classes, this kind of rogue adrenal tumor was always framed as an incredibly rare zebra, like a medical anomaly you'd read about but never actually see in real life.
For decades, that was the textbook consensus. Doctors thought it caused maybe 1% of hypertension cases tops.
But when researchers finally started doing systematic screening on large groups of patients, specifically people whose blood pressure wasn't responding to 3 or 4 different medications, they realized the old textbooks were just entirely wrong about how common this is.
Yeah, the work of researchers like David Calhoun showed autonomous aldosterone excess causes roughly 1 in 5 cases of treatment-resistant hypertension.
1 in 5, that is wild.
It's a classic case of not finding what you don't systematically look for, because the tumor doesn't always show up on standard scans, and the blood tests are tricky to interpret. Millions of people were walking around with a rogue adrenal gland driving their blood pressure up, and they were just given more generic pills that didn't target the actual problem.
So once science realized how much damage a runaway RAS cascade can cause, whether from a narrowed kidney artery or a rogue adrenal gland, they had to figure out how to shut the machine down. And the solution they found is honestly one of the wildest stories in modern medicine. They didn't find the answer in a sterile lab. They found it in a jungle.
They found it in the venom of the Brazilian pit viper, thanks to research by Ferreira and Vane in the 1960s.
Okay, you have to explain how a deadly snake venom becomes a blood pressure pill.
Well, back then, researchers observed that when this specific pit viper bit its prey, the animal didn't die from a neurotoxin. It collapsed because its blood pressure instantly plummeted to absolute zero. When pharmacologists broke down the venom, they discovered it contained specific peptides that perfectly disabled the ACE enzyme in the lungs.
The second pair of scissors.
Exactly. The venom stops the body from creating angiotensin II. Without that effector molecule, all the blood vessels instantly relaxed and the pressure just crashed. By 1981, chemists at Squibb took that venom's mechanism and engineered a synthetic version into a daily pill called captopril.
The very first ACE inhibitor.
Right. It revolutionized cardiovascular medicine.
By just gumming up those biological scissors, they could shut off the whole pathological cascade. But there was a catch. Because biology is never that simple, is it? That ACE enzyme in the lungs doesn't just make angiotensin II. It has a side job.
It does. ACE is also responsible for breaking down and clearing out a completely different inflammatory substance called bradykinin. If you give a patient an ACE inhibitor to stop their blood pressure, you're also stopping them from clearing out bradykinin.
And bradykinin builds up in the lungs, irritating the tissue.
Which results in the famous ACE inhibitor dry cough. Roughly 10 to 20% of people who take these medications develop a persistent, ticklish cough simply because their lungs are accumulating bradykinin.
That perfectly explains the why behind that side effect. So ACE inhibitors were a massive success, cough notwithstanding. But this success led to what you might call medical hubris.
Yeah, the sledgehammer approach.
Right. Doctors started thinking, well, if blocking the cascade at one point works well, let's block it at multiple points. They had developed another class of drugs called ARBs that block the receptors where angiotensin II actually lands on the cells. And they had direct renin inhibitors. And they thought, let's give patients these drugs at the same time. Let's completely annihilate the RAAS system.
They ran massive clinical trials to test this double blockade theory, the On-Target trial in 2008 and the Altitude trial in 2011, and the results were catastrophic.
The trials actually had to be halted, didn't they? Patients who had the entire system blocked were suffering from rampant acute kidney failure. They ended up on dialysis. They had fatal spikes in potassium. Why did shutting down the system destroy the kidneys? Weren't we trying to protect them?
This brings us back to the sheer mechanics of how a kidney filter works. The filter is essentially a microscopic ball of capillaries. To push waste out of the blood and into the urine, there needs to be intense physical pressure inside that ball.
It's like a coffee espresso machine. If there's no pressure pushing the water through the grounds, you don't get anything out.
That's a great analogy. And the way the kidney maintains that high pressure inside the filter is by controlling the pipes on either side of it. The entrance pipe needs to be wide open to let blood in, and the exit pipe needs to be slightly pinched to create a backlog of pressure.
And angiotensin II is the thing pinching that exit pipe.
Yes. Even in a healthy person, you need a baseline level of angiotensin II to keep that exit pipe tight, so the filter has enough back pressure to do its job. When doctors gave patients a double blockade, they completely removed all angiotensin II. The exit pipe relaxed wide open. All the pressure inside the filter bled out, the filtration stopped, and the kidneys just failed.
Which perfectly explains a massive real-world danger that doctors see in emergency rooms all the time now. It's known as the triple whammy of kidney injury. This happens when a patient is taking their prescribed blood pressure pill, like an ACE inhibitor or an ARB, and they get a headache or joint pain, so they take a high dose of an over-the-counter NSAID, like ibuprofen. And maybe they're also on a diuretic, a water pill.
The triple whammy is just a perfect storm of physics destroying the kidney. Let's trace it. We just established that the ACE inhibitor dilates the exit pipe, lowering the back pressure.
Okay, so the back pressure is gone.
Then you add the NSAID. NSAID has a side effect of clamping down the entrance pipe. They restrict blood flow into the kidney.
So now we have no blood coming in, and the exit is wide open.
And then you add the diuretic, which drains fluid out of the entire body, lowering the overall volume of blood.
It is the ultimate disaster for the espresso machine. It's literally like cutting the brake lines, emptying the gas tank, and removing the steering wheel, all at exactly the same time. The pressure drops to absolute zero, the kidney cells start to suffocate from lack of flow, and they die. It's acute kidney injury, entirely caused by perfectly normal medications interacting in a way that destroys the physics of filtration.
And it is entirely preventable if patients and clinicians understand the underlying plumbing of the RAAS. You can't just sledgehammer this system because it is a fundamental pillar of homeostasis.
And if you try to sledgehammer it, the body often finds a way to fight back anyway.
Yeah, this is one of the most fascinating modern discoveries. For the longest time, we thought of this strictly as an endocrine system, hormones floating in the bloodstream. But we now know that tissues like your heart, your brain, and your blood vessels have their own local private RAAS systems.
They manufacture their own blood pressure chemicals right there in the tissue.
And they have a backup plan. If you completely block the ACE enzyme in the lungs with a drug, the heart tissue can deploy a totally different enzyme called chymase. Chymase acts as an alternative pair of scissors. It just steps in and manufactures angiotensin II locally, completely bypassing the drug you're taking.
That is wild. The body is essentially bootlegging its own blood pressure molecules because it refuses to let the pressure drop.
It's called angiotensin escape, and it helps explain why hypertension is so incredibly difficult to manage in some patients. It also highlights a major flaw in how we historically treated the disease. For decades, the assumption was, if a patient has high blood pressure, they must have too much renin.
But when researchers finally looked at huge populations of patients like in the ONHAT trial, specifically looking at older adults and Black patients, they realized we had the mechanism completely backwards for many of them. Their bodies weren't making too much renin. In fact, their renin levels were incredibly low.
Because their hypertension was driven by volume, their kidneys were holding onto too much salt and water, the plumbing was overfilled. In those patients, the body had actually turned the renin alarm off in a desperate attempt to lower the pressure.
So if you give those patients an ACE inhibitor to block a renin cascade that is already turned off, it's not going to do much. You're trying to put out a fire that isn't there while ignoring the flood in the basement. They need a drug that helps them get rid of the volume, like a diuretic.
Exactly. It proved that high blood pressure isn't just one disease, it's a spectrum. On one end, you have patients with tight, constricted blood vessels driven by the renin alarm. On the other end, you have patients with overfilled blood vessels driven by salt and volume. and you have to match the drug to the underlying physics of the patient.
And the more we dug into this, the more we realized these hormones aren't just about pressure. Take aldosterone, that hormone from the adrenal gland that makes you hoard salt. It turns out aldosterone is highly toxic to the heart.
It causes direct structural damage. The 1999 RAAS trial proved this. Researchers discovered that high levels of aldosterone directly instruct the cells in the heart muscle to lay down scar tissue. It causes intense cardiac fibrosis. The heart gets stiff and fails.
But if the body is capable of this much self-destruction, surely there has to be some sort of internal brake pedal. It can't all just be accelerators.
There is a brake pedal, and its discovery changed everything. We found a counter-regulatory arm in the body built around a receptor called the MAS receptor and a slightly different enzyme called ACE2.
ACE2, wait.
Instead of making the dangerous angiotensin II, this ACE2 enzyme makes a totally different peptide angiotensin-17 that relaxes blood vessels, clears out scar tissue, and soothes inflammation. It directly opposes everything the classic alarm system does.
I have to stop you because I recognize that name, ACE2. Are you saying the very enzyme that acts as our internal brake against high blood pressure is the exact doorknob a global pandemic virus used to infect us?
Yes. ACE2 is the precise cell surface receptor that the SARS-CoV-2 spike protein binds to in order to enter human cells. The COVID-19 virus literally hijacked our blood pressure brake pedal.
That is deeply unsettling, and it makes total sense why, early in the pandemic, cardiologists were in an absolute panic. Nobody knew if taking an ACE inhibitor for blood pressure was making patients more vulnerable to the virus by altering these receptors, or if it was somehow protecting them.
It thrust this incredibly obscure corner of renal physiology right onto the front pages of newspapers globally. Ultimately, massive data analysis showed the medications were safe to continue, but it proved how deeply intertwined this single hormonal cascade is with our fundamental biology.
So what does all this mean for you listening right now? If you or someone you love takes an ACE inhibitor, an ARB, or a diuretic for hypertension or heart failure, you are part of a massive global population walking around with a deliberately suppressed RAAS. Everyday things like the reason dietary sodium guidelines exist, or why your doctor chooses one specific pill over another, trace directly back to this precise redundant alarm system and those population differences in renin.
It is operating in the background of your life every single second, constantly calculating flow, pressure, and salt.
But tracing the evolution of this system leaves me with a really lingering thought. We've established that the RAAS evolved as a highly aggressive, redundant emergency system. It is perfectly designed to save us from acute volume loss like bleeding out after a predator attack, or severe dehydration while crossing a desert. It's a system perfectly engineered to keep a hunter-gatherer alive in a world of constant physical peril and extreme salt scarcity. But look at us now. We live in a modern world of sedentary lifestyles, chronic stress, and diets absolutely loaded with excess sodium. Is this ancient survival mechanism, this brilliant thermostat, now the very thing slowly killing us? Are our bodies basically walking around with a fire alarm blaring in an empty building, desperately trying to heat a house that is already burning down? Something to mull over the next time you look at a glass of water or grab a salty snack. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.